Welcome everyone. My name is Rob and I'm one of the technical trainers with Decisions. In this course, we're going to be covering data mapping basics. The learning objectives for this course are as follows. We will discuss what data mapping is. We're going to discuss the basic mapping types, the difference between the mapping editor and the property grid, and common input and output mapping options for steps. The action of applying data to a step is known as mapping. In the previous video, we covered variables and data types, which are the data that is being applied. This Intro to Data Mapping section is going to cover how to utilize our created variables by mapping them to the inputs of our steps and flows. Before we get started, let's recall some basic concepts. In the Flow Designer overview, we covered that you can find the inputs and the outputs for every step in the Properties panel. They will have their own section in the Properties. Most of the mapping discussion in this section will involve this view of the inputs, but all of these concepts also apply to the mapping editor. The data type is the formatting of the data needed for this input and output. The input variable is the data name for the dynamic value that is currently selected and mapped in. The mapping type controls the different ways in which you can assign values to an input or to an output. These are always going to be crucial information to gather when you are mapping data in a flow. Let's have a look at flow data. Flow data is the sum of all of the outputs available in the current flow. We can think of these flows as a river flowing from the start to the end. Information only moves downstream and cannot be obtained from the steps upstream. Take this image for example. If I'm trying to set up the inputs to pass into B and I'm looking for the information from C, I will not find any of the variables from there. Instead, I can only use the outputs from A and the default flow data, but nothing from C or D can be used. New values become available to use in your flow, but are only available downstream of that step. Being able to locate where your data is will be crucial when you're trying to save, evaluate, or edit your variables and data structures. It is often the case that losing track of your variables and the current state of their values will lead to a very frustrating debugging experience. Let's take a look at a specific example of this. After the start step, you will always have the flow data, system constants, and any specified inputs, like base 1 and 2, by default. Any new outputs from a step will be added to the flow data and will appear in the next steps downstream. Here we can see that when the add step is configured, it adds sum of bases to the flow data. After multiply, you'll have all the same inputs available, and also the base times height variable. Finally, at the end of the flow, you can output any of the variables you've used throughout the process. Again, you cannot use data unless it is downstream, which is why a final area was not available in the multiply step, for example. The method by which data is mapped to a step is known as its mapping type. Depending on the mapping type, data may be defined from the step itself or broken into individual properties and mapped separately. The four most common mapping types are constant, select from flow, and ignore/null. The first, constant, allows us to set a static value for that variable. When that step is executed, it will always use the chosen constant value. This mapping type is commonly used when mapping properties that will not change or setting up rules. Let's say you're using a send email step. You may want every email to be sent from the same email address. You would set that email as a constant value in the field. The second and most popular option is select from flow. Here, you will choose information that exists in the flow from previous steps. This allows the input to be dynamic and change based on what the rest of the flow has coming in it before that step. For example, you may want to source the receipt email from a variable earlier in the flow. Select the flow will allow you to take a previously created variable to be used as the input. Ignore and null are two very similar options that can leave inputs empty. Ignore will completely disregard the value. Null will set the value to null. While these seem very similar, there is a slight difference. Ignore will be used when a value is not used or provided elsewhere later in the flow. A null value is often not used unless for very specific cases. The mapping editor contains the ability to use all the mapping options mentioned previously, as well as others we will discuss at the end of the lesson. The biggest feature of the mapping editor is it allows you to click and drag inputs and outputs to their desired locations. This will make mapping data from the flow data to be available as inputs much faster when there are a lot of them. You'll be able to dig into the different variables of the composite type and map them to inputs instead of having to manually select them one at a time like in the Properties panel. As you can see in the screenshot, the inventory form input was expanded by the arrow, and the desired input value was dragged to the input. The Properties panel also allows the use of mapping types, but provides a different view for the available inputs. Rather than arrows to expand some data types, clicking them will show the inputs variables available to the input in a list. If none are selected, then it will display the flow data. If a value has already been selected, like shown here, then it will display the selectable variables within that selected item. If they are grayed out, that indicates that this input does not match the data type. However, just because a variable is grayed out does not mean that it cannot be selected. Often, you will need to seek values within composite and complex data type structures, and then these will appear grayed out as they do not match the data type the input is looking for. But one of the variables contained within that might match. For example, the screenshot shows that the inventory form input was clicked, and the next one can be selected from that new menu that appears. Now let's look at each of the options for mapping inputs on a step. We have already discussed a few of these, but we will briefly review them as we reach the options and see how they look in the designer. The first is constant, which is a static value that will not change. Then we have select from flow, which allows you to select data as an input from available data that will point in the flow. Null is a placeholder corresponding to nothing, while ignore will tell the flow that the input is not needed at this time. It will pass in an empty value, unlike the null setting. Converters allow a user to run a flow that can take in data and output a completely different type of data that the step needs. By expanding converters, you can see suggestions for the next step, or you can pick or create your own so you know what you are looking for. Finally, you can merge strings into an either HTML, which allows options like font styles, or plain text. When a step is outputting information, you can also change the output type based on the needs of the flow. These are not nearly as widely used as the input options, but there are still possible uses for them and are worth exploring. The first option is change value. This will allow you to keep an existing variable, but change the value of it rather than making a new variable. The second option is the most used output option, and that is rename. Rename will make a new variable and allow you to change the name of it. There is always a default name for this, but it is best practice to give it a name benefiting of its function and use of the flow. Reference will rerun the step to get the value rather than storing the value in memory. Ignore means that we do not care about this output and it will not pass any data out of the step. Pass-through will maintain the name and pass it through to the next step. For a form, this is the data name you set on the form control. For steps, this will be the default option, such as add one output. Finally, you can have converters set up on the output of a step in the same way we explained for the inputs. So let's take a look in decisions. The first thing we're going to do is set up input data. We can do that by defining input data, and we're going to call this original number. We're going to make this a decimal and hit save. Now we can use logical math and do something like add. From here, we can add, and then we're going to say the value 1, we will make it and we'll select it from flow and we'll call it the original number, the input. We can define this when we debug. The value 2 is what we're going to add to the original number, so we can say just 2 for simplicity. It changes it to a constant. Now, if I connect the add step to the end step and run a debug, it'll give me the option to specify what the original number is because I defined that as an input. I can say 5. When I run the debug, it'll say 5 plus 2 equals 7. A thing to note as well, remember, when selecting from flow, you can only see things that come previously in the flow. So here on value 1, if I go to edit it, the only options I have are flow data or original number. I can name this output, addition, output. So we know what it means later on. Now, we can take this and run multiply. With multiply, if I select from flow, the value, notice how now I have addition output because it comes previously in the flow. I can take that and multiply it by 3. So now I have logic that takes a number, adds 2 to it, and then multiplies it by 3. Hopefully you can see how this would eventually compound out. Let's test the debugger. I'll put 5 in again. The inputs and outputs for my add step should still be 7. And then when I go to multiply, it takes that 7 from the previous step, multiplies it by 3 to give you an output of 21. Mapping your outputs is important to make sure that you get the data out of the flow that you want to, and is especially important when using subflows. Let's take a look at some of the other stuff that we talked about in the presentation. We mapped our inputs for this using the Properties panel. You can also map your inputs using the Input Mapping Editor on the top right. Notice how we have the original number, which we set up as input data, and it is connected to value 1 of our addition step. When we go to multiply and look at that input mapper, the left side will be the add 1 output into one of the values of this step, the additional 1 output out of the value. Underneath this dropdown, you get additional options for formatting if you want to do so. Remember, on steps and end steps, you can also run converters and change how your output is shown. You can adjust it to a constant, you can clear, you can ignore, or run null. Thank you.